Tonight, the 2024 election is here.
America's comeback starts right now.
Former President Donald Trump announcing a third run for the White House.
Plus, the latest on the missile strike hitting inside a NATO member country as Russia's war in Ukraine rages on.
It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia.
And finally off the ground.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The breakthrough blastoff of the Artemis 1 rocket.
All this and more tonight on Fake Nation.
Will Republicans rally behind Donald Trump for a third time? Welcome to Faith Nation from our studio in Washington. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening, I'm Jenna Browder. That is the big question. Now that former President Donald Trump has officially announced his candidacy for 2024, his message the same: make America great again.
That's right. Despite disappointing midterm results for the GOP, former President Donald Trump is still popular among Republican-based voters. But what about the rest of the party? CBN's Matt Galka reports.
America's comeback starts right now.
Donald Trump didn't waste much time to make his big announcement. Speculation about another bid for the White House came true as the former president announced a third try for the commander-in-chief spot.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
Trump spent part of his speech attacking the current administration and said America was in decline. He mostly stayed away from the 2020 election after claiming it was rigged and stolen from him for the past 2 years since his loss.
The United States has been embarrassed, humiliated, and weakened for all to see.
Trump formally filed paperwork for his 2024 candidacy. Meanwhile, President Biden tweeted during the announcement a video with the text, "Donald Trump failed America."
We will treat those people from January 6th fairly.
The unusually early announcement comes after lackluster results for Republicans in last week's midterm elections. After predictions of a red wave sweeping the House and potentially flipping the Senate, the GOP looks to gain only a bare majority in the House, and the Senate remains in Democrat control. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the party didn't appeal enough to voters in the middle.
We underperformed among independents and moderates because their impression of many of the people in our party in leadership roles is that they're involved in chaos, negativity, excessive attacks, and it frightened independent and moderate Republican voters.
Democrats used Trump's messaging against many of his endorsed candidates throughout the midterms. It led to losses for some high-profile Trump picks.
The so-called GOP red wave turned into a red wedding for extreme MAGA Republicans and election deniers in race after race after race all across the country. Here's the Republican response: the cult leader should run again.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is perceived to be the top rival to another Trump nomination, but some analysts say they'll believe it when they see it.
It doesn't carry quite as much weight considering many of the highest profile endorsed candidates didn't do as well in these elections, but he's still the most popular person among base Republican voters. And until someone takes that away from him, he has to be regarded as the frontrunner.
The announcement comes as the former president is still dogged by plenty of legal challenges. In New York, the Attorney General filed a lawsuit alleging fraud in some of his business practices. He's also the subject of a probe in Georgia investigating his alleged attempts to possibly try and overturn the 2020 election. He's also failed to comply with a subpoena from the January 6th committee investigating the Capitol riots. Matt Galka, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Matt. And here now for more, CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody. David, I'd like to start with just your initial reaction to Trump's announcement last night.
Well, there's a lot to sift through, but I'll just kind of leave it at this. I thought one thing that struck me, Jenna, was when he talked about what 2024 would look like. He literally said that Americans haven't seen the worst of it yet. And so what he's saying is in 2 years, he's predicting that America will look even worse than it does today. And Donald Trump has a pretty good spidey sense. So I think what he's calculating here is that if America is not doing very well at all in 2 years, even worse than today, and Biden's still on the ballot, that's going to be, as Trump would say, good for Trump. And so I think that was one thing that struck me. The other thing I thought was interesting is that he didn't really talk about the 2020 election at all. He did talk about election integrity, talked about the voting, talked about paper ballots, he talked about all that, but he didn't harp on this idea of, what happened to me on January 6th was terrible. The election was stolen from me. He didn't do any of that. And I think if he can kind of focus on the future and not look back as much, I think that'll help him with independence, because he already had MAGA. He had MAGA at hello. He needs to broaden it out for 2024.
Critics, David, panned Trump's announcement as, quote, a snooze fest. Fox News even dipped out of coverage last night. The New York Post's headline says, "Done with Don." On the other side of the spectrum, David, President Biden's political Twitter, as we just saw in Matt's package, prior to and during the speech, put out videos undercutting the former president, part of what the White House has dubbed the Trump Project. David, your response to the reaction?
Well, look, this was not going to be 2015. It wasn't going to be the gold escalator. I was looking for the gold escalator, and Jenna, you know this, but everything at Mar-a-Lago is gold. Where was the gold escalator? But they didn't put that in there at all. So, look, it's not going to be that way. And look, he's a former president who has a track record of accomplishments, the way the White House, the way he sees it. And so it's going to have a different vibe. And plus, it was there at Mar-a-Lago. I think he wanted it to be a little bit more low key. I know Donald Trump and low key, but I think right now, especially coming out of the midterms, it was probably the right tenor and tone to do exactly that.
Trump's best hope in 2024 is to have a crowded primary field. David, do you think that'll happen, or do you think someone like Ron DeSantis could upstage the former president?
Well, it's the $64,000 question. And how much time do we have? Gabe, how much time? Because I can talk about this. How much time do we have? All right. Look, here's the bottom line. DeSantis has a decision to make. What is he going to do? Now, okay, see, I'm going to go for 7.5 minutes. Sorry. But look, I'll just say this in 30 seconds. The answer to your question is, I think it will be a pretty crowded field. Mike Pompeo's going to get in. I think DeSantis wants to get in. I think it could really backfire. Does Ron DeSantis want to be the next Lying Ted or Little Marco? I mean, if he thought Ron DeSanctimonious was bad, that's just child's play. Trump is just warming up. I'm not quite sure that Ron DeSantis wants to get mixed up in all that. The future seems better than the present for DeSantis. We'll see. I don't think he sees it that way, but we'll see.
All right, CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody. Thanks, David, for your insights.
You bet.
Well, an unfortunate accident. That's how Poland's president describes a deadly missile strike that killed 2 people in a village near the eastern border with Ukraine. Initially, the missiles were thought to be fired by Russia, but President Andrzej Duda says there's a high chance they were actually Ukrainian counter-defense missiles. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg today echoed that hypothesis while squarely laying the blame on Russia.
Our preliminary analysis suggests that the incident was likely caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile fired to defend Ukrainian territory against Russian cruise missile attacks. But let me be clear, this is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
Now, the Kremlin denies all responsibility. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says the United States will continue working with allies to gather more information, and he's pledged to increase air defense support for Ukraine.
And joining us now is Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael, welcome. Good to see you this evening. So the Secretary of Defense has reiterated that Russia ultimately bears the responsibility here. But if the preliminary assessments are correct, and this is a Ukrainian air defense missile that landed in Poland, what kind of defense obligations does the U.S. have to meet in terms of NATO's Article 5?
There aren't really any obligations for us to do any particular response. For one thing, if you read Article 5, under any circumstances, it's always our prerogative to decide how to respond. There's a strong implication that we would use military force, and certainly in the event of an all-out attack against an ally that was at risk of being, annexed or carved up. It's pretty hard to read Article 5 as allowing anything but a very robust response. But in the case of an accident or a very limited use of force, Article 5 doesn't try to put us into a doomsday machine mentality where all the decisions are taken out of the president's hands. So Article 5 simply implies a strong response. It doesn't say what it would be.
Michael, initially it was hard to sift through information, though President Biden did try to get out in front of this incident early on, suggesting that it was not Russia. Michael, did the United States have intelligence that Poland or our NATO allies didn't have to make that assessment so early on, or was that in part a calculation to de-escalate the situation?
No, my guess is that the Poles actually were telling us what they were finding on their territory. It's possible that we just deduced that there was the distinct possibility of a defensive missile being fired and then coming back to Earth. But I think the Poles and the Ukrainians, who collaborate, by the way, very closely with each other and are pretty sophisticated. The Poles really are, a remarkable ally, have come a long way in a relatively short time as part of the NATO alliance. I think they have the forensic evidence. It's probably the actual physical remnants of the missile that were just as important as anything else for figuring out what it was. So my guess is that Biden did not know separately, independently, or before the Poles themselves would have known.
Michael, just a few seconds left, but as the war drags on in Ukraine, what happens to U.S. support for Ukraine, especially if the House goes to the GOP and then we have a Democratic White House? How do you see this playing out?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but my Republican friends that I know, they tend to be pretty hawkish and tough. And I don't know too many who would want to see Vladimir Putin win this war. So I don't think, even with a MAGA-influenced, partly MAGA-oriented Republican Party, I don't see the table shifting 180 degrees. However, if we get into a stalemate next spring and summer, then I think regardless of whether you're MAGA or not, Republican or Democrat, pro-Ukraine or not, because most of us are pro-Ukraine, you're going to have to ask, should we be trying to steer this conflict towards the negotiating table with a little stronger American hand than we are right now? I think that will be a legitimate question, and it has almost nothing to do with you're pro or anti-Trump. It has more to do with how the war itself could evolve between now and the spring or summer.
All right, Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution, thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Coming up, a rumble in the ranks of Republican leadership in the Senate and how Democrats could take advantage of the discord. Next.
Welcome back. Tonight, power in the House is tilting by a thread towards Republicans, where the GOP needs one more seat to hold the majority. Control is still in flux, even as Congress returns to the lame duck portion of President Biden's first term in the White House. More than a week after the polls closed, Republicans have 217 seats in the House, one short of the 218 needed to give the Speaker's gavel to the GOP. The Democrats, who have held the House since 2018, have 209 seats.
Well, over in the Senate, it looks like Mitch McConnell will remain the Republican minority leader, staving off a challenge from Florida Senator Rick Scott. McConnell winning by an overwhelming margin.
I don't own this job. Anybody who wants to run for it can feel free to do so. And so I'm not in any way offended by having an opponent or having a few votes in opposition.
The leadership scuffle led by Senator Scott highlights a rift over GOP strategy in the Senate. Democrats almost sure to take advantage of that division. Today, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer calling for all 11 million undocumented migrants in the United States to be given amnesty. He's also introducing a bill conservatives see as controversial, which would codify same-sex marriage during the lame duck session. Well, Marie Eisenstein is an associate professor of political science at Indiana University Northwest, and she joins us now. Marie, welcome. First off, as Jenna was just mentioning, we have all these House races. It looks like it's hanging on a thread here. As of our news time, Republicans are just one seat away. What's behind these races taking so long to be called? Is it legal challenges? Is it the election reform laws that have made it more difficult? Is it redistricting? Or is this just the way things work in 2022?
It's simply mail-in voting. So like all the West Coast, mostly those states do mail-in voting. So so out West we just see, and this is where I think a bulk of the the House races that haven't been called are. And this is just a huge and significant change because it changes a one-day event, Election Day, into an extended process where you have to accept and count votes that come in, say, a week after Election Day. And it just changes how votes are counted, too, because California does all mail-in voting. So it's no more where you have people going to the polls and it's being tabulated. It all has to be tabulated as it comes in through the mail. So,
right.
And this is a huge, huge change.
Yeah. Leader McConnell easily swatted back Rick Scott's challenge, but it does expose a rift in the upper chamber. Maria, are we already seeing Democrats taking advantage of that?
Oh, probably. I guess I consider some of this normal, the infighting, not just the fighting between political parties, but the infighting within political parties for strategy, particularly after the Republicans thought that they would do much better than they did in these midterms, and thought that they might have a real chance to flip the Senate to Republican control. And now we know that that's not the case. It's not so much taking advantage of it, but I think that what the Democrats realize now is that they're not going to have control of both chambers come the new year. So now they want to move forward with any legislation that they don't think that they can get through a Republican House.
Marie, real quickly, we only have about 15 seconds or so, but would you be surprised to see Republican support to advance the Respect for Marriage Act?
A bit surprised that they're going to be able, the projection is that they're going to be able to get the 10 Republican votes needed to make sure that there's no filibuster, to break a filibuster. And that is a little bit shocking to me. I thought that there would be more Republican opposition to that than there apparently is. No. We don't know yet because we still don't have that vote in.
Right.
All right, Marie Eisenstein at Indiana University Northwest. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie.
Thank you.
And when we come back, how an Israeli artist is connecting the ancient art of the Bible to modern times.
And welcome back. October was Israel's best month for tourism since the start of the pandemic, with ancient biblical sites attracting the most attention from visitors to the Holy Land.
Yeah, and now there's a move among some Israelis to build interest in the modern by making a connection to the ancient. CBN's Julie Stahl shows us how one artist is making that happen.
You're looking at what's called archaeology, the first art exhibit in an active archaeological site.
In Jerusalem, sometimes the best stories are found underground. Here, next to the ancient stones of the Temple Mount, an art exhibit links the past with the present.
I had this idea of putting my pieces in like a cave, something that would connect it to ancient archaeology and to the past, because the works that I make are inspired all from ancient history, ancient Egyptian, ancient Etruscan, ancient Israelite.
Artist Nicole Kornberg-Jacobovici says most of her work relates to the Middle to Late Bronze Age, looking back some 3,000 years.
Dr. Yuval Baruch had an idea, an amazing idea, to place the pieces, the art pieces that he had seen in the site where he's working, which is an old water cistern dating from the time of the first temple.
Dr. Yuval Baruch of the Israel Antiquities Authority says the organization is excavating here very close to the Western Wall foundations.
And one of the questions that I ask myself, and when I say ask myself daily, is how to build a bridge between the people and the ruins.
Baruch says when he saw Nicole's art, it sparked an idea of going beyond guided tours and museums to connect people to archaeology.
I understand that art is also another language that can allow us to build this bridge.
And the fact that her art is ceramic is even more significant.
When we excavated, what the most things we found is the sherds. And the shirt for us is like letters. From these letters, we can understand the period, understand the date, we can understand for what this place used, if it is a dwelling house or maybe a palace.
Archaeologist and art historian Irit Ziffer says the clay connection goes back even further.
Oh, material is clay, it's mud from the earth. And this is what man was made of. The first man, the first Adam, was made out of clay. It was a figurine into which God breathed life.
Ziffer is curator of the exhibit.
Really was amazed by is Nicole's versatile ways in dealing with clay. She's a takeoff on the ancient things, but she doesn't do ancient things. She does contemporary art.
Some of Nicole's artwork includes a piece with fish inspired by the story of Jonah.
So the blue one is a reference to the Nile, ancient Nile, the place where Moses was found, and then the story preceding this story of the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. The blue plate is a reference to the tree of life. It's got birds and flowers. It's imagining what it would have looked like.
And a special stamp like ancient leaders would have used to stamp their names and tell their stories. This one rolls out the story of Joseph's dreams. While this current exhibit is temporary, there are plans for a traveling exhibit to help connect the Bible to modern times through art around the world. Julie Stahl, CBN News, near the Western Wall Foundation's Jerusalem.
Thank you, Julie. Coming up, liftoff and kickoff to the future of mankind in space.
And finally tonight, for the first time in 5 decades, NASA is headed back to the moon in its high-stakes Artemis 1 mission.
Well, after several scrubbed attempts and riding out Hurricane Nicole last week, the most powerful rocket in the world successfully blasted off from the Kennedy Space Center this morning.
3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
Now it's on its way to the moon. The rocket will send the Orion space capsule into orbit with test dummies on board, getting one step closer to NASA's goal, which is establishing a human presence on the moon before the end of the decade. Jenna, I never get tired of seeing those blast-offs.
It's beautiful and inspiring.
Yes, absolutely. Can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, to the moon and beyond.
Well, thanks for joining us for Faith Nation.
Have a great night.